Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective with me, Julie Ali. It is Women's Month and I have the good fortune of profiling the most amazing women that have crossed my path. Another amazing woman that we're featuring on the show today hails from Britain. She is visiting South Africa for a very special assignment. We will talk to her about it just now, but let me tell you who my guest is on the show this morning. She's an author and she's also a retired BBC journalist. Her name is Arjumand Wajid, and we're going to be talking to her about life as a journalist with the BBC, and then, of course, the reason for her book on a political activist in South Africa. And that, of course, is the late Fatima Meer. But let's get talking to this amazing woman, and she is Arjumand Wajid. Assalamu alaikum to you. Welcome to the program. I do hope you can hear me loudly and clearly.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for having me.
Welcome to South Africa. You are here for a very special purpose, but you are no stranger to our country. We will talk about your book a little later on in the show. But of course, let's start off with you. You were born and brought up in Pakistan. You went to Britain as a very young bride in the year 1968. And that's where your life, I should imagine, took a change. You continued studying whilst you were in the UK, and then you obviously graduated with a degree in journalism. And then over time, you landed up with the BBC, and I guess that is history making in itself.
I did indeed, yes. I was born in Pakistan, and at that time, let's say 70 odd years ago, environments were very different. I grew up like very innocent, naive girl, and then I got married to a man who was already working in UK. And so I arrived as a young bride, and pretty much I grew up in UK because a 20-year-old then was almost like a 12-year-old today. You know, no TV and no internet or nothing. So I was quite innocent and green. And yeah, so since then I have been there and settled down. Sorry, I didn't hear the second part of the question.
All right. Whilst you were in Pakistan, you studied philosophy and geography. But when you moved...
I did.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay. So whilst you were still in Pakistan before your marriage, you studied philosophy and geography. When you moved to the UK, you then furthered your studies. Why did you decide to choose journalism?
And for a start, because I already had interest in literature and writing at school, and at college I used to write for the college magazine, etc. And also I looked at myself. By then I had 2 children, and I consciously thought, what is the career that I can now choose, which does not, again, require long period of study or training like medicine or law, which was my dream at one time. And so I thought that writing is something I can do, and it's something that would interest me, and I do not need to really go back to college. In fact, I realized later that I did, because Pakistani degree actually was not very helpful to get a job in British media. So I went back to college. I did an honors degree in journalism. And so slowly, with a great deal of struggle, because at that time, can you imagine a colored woman, English language as the second language? It was unimaginable. A lot of the time, editors said to me, why do you want to be a journalist? Why don't you just go and take a civil service job? Which meant work as a filing clerk in the local authority. Anyway, I was sure that if others can do it, I can do it. That has been my philosophy all my life. And so I stuck to it and finally got a job with a local newspaper, which is the best training ground, I tell you, for journalism. And then at the end of that, I probably was going to stay in the print media unless there hadn't been a strike That was Margaret Thatcher's time. She started changing laws and she deliberately weakened the unions. And her intention was to break the unions. And there are many famous incidents I won't go into. But one of them was to actually change the laws to weaken the media. And so I was a member of National Union of Journalists. And as is the procedure, they came and they said, okay, your company has de-recognized the union, and so you need to go on strike. And I already kind of was committed that there need to be a balance of power. There are workers' rights. I was beginning to learn and becoming conscious of the political issues, etc. So we went on strike. We were on picket line for a whole year. By the end, there were only 6, 7 of us were left. And then the union itself decided that, okay, now it's time to go and look for jobs. And I was very lucky that I got my first job after a year-long strike with the BBC World Service. So that's how it came about.
Wonderful. You talk about the best grounding and training for journalists is to join a newspaper, one of the dailies, wherever you are. But with the advancement of technology, we know where we're sitting now regarding broadsheets. I'm not sure what the situation's like in the UK, but certainly in South Africa, it almost seems as if broadsheets are a thing of the past because we consume news very differently on our handheld devices, or we go to perhaps our TVs to consume news. What do you believe now should be happening with the generation coming through in the media spaces? Because the media landscape has changed absolutely and dramatically.
You're quite right, it has. I mean, so many things have changed, and that's the reason that even in UK, lots and lots of newspapers have closed down. And the local newspapers have become free sheets, or they don't exist anymore, they have closed down. This really was the best training ground for journalists because you were at the first line of reporting. You had direct contact with the people about whom you're writing. For instance, if there's a murder story, you went to the family, you went to the court, you saw the murder, you saw the family affected, blah, blah, blah. And the national newspapers would very often take stories from the local reporter. And I was a stringer, as they were called at the time, we would call them, for many national newspapers and even the BBC. So now most of them, at least the national newspapers, the TV, they rely on agencies. And so most of the junior journalists do not have the same training. They are now coming out of universities and media courses, and they're really not media courses and the big degrees about the media. They do not actually do the vocational training, to teach you the local law, how to take an interview, how to write about the councils or attend the council meeting, all that. And looking back now, I was very fortunate that I was probably the last generation who was able to do that. What I think the media, I wish they would do, and maybe big newspapers still do it, they should have training plans and training programs in-house. At that time too, for most journalists, they did not come out of colleges and universities in my days. They were school leavers. They would take a trainee job, sometimes even like a tea boy in a newspaper, and they got most of the training in-house. Slowly they were, taught how to write. Those days, we had old-fashioned typewriters and shorthand and all that. But I think now media, big organizations need to have in-house vocational training, not theoretical training and not the high media courses. But I don't know whether that's possible, that's practical, because a lot of media organizations don't have the resources and the means. But that's what I would suggest or I'd like to see.
So undoubtedly, the media landscape has changed, and it will continue changing as we know technology is changing so rapidly, moving so rapidly. And I kind of wonder what will the media landscape look like perhaps in 5 and 10 years from now. I wish I had a crystal ball to look into it to see what that outcome would look like. But we're moving along now, and let's go for our first ad break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to author and retired BBC journalist Arjumand Wajid. She is living in the UK, but she's in South Africa for a book launch, and I'm talking with her via Zoom. She's currently in Durban for the book launch, so stay with us. Welcome back. My guest is Arjumand Wajid. She's an author and she's also a retired BBC journalist. She's in South Africa to launch her book, which is written on the late Fatima Meer. But a little more about Arju's life. She is a passionate human rights activist, and having been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, she was also involved in the nuclear disarmament in the 80s. She's now an active member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So Arju, back to you. And I find it pretty strange to hear about people in the West, people in England particularly, refer to themselves as non-whites, number one, and number two, having been anti-apartheid activists. What was that all about? Were you based in the UK and still raising the flag for the people in South Africa against apartheid?
Yes, in the 80s especially, I think by the time I got involved and I became aware of it, anti-apartheid movement was one of the strongest causes that people rallied around. And the other one was a CND, that's Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And I slowly got first involved in the local branches of these organizations, along with other charity groups that I was involved with, like the Oxfam and so on. So, but CND and anti-apartheid movement, they were national movements. And there would be huge big rallies in London. And I remember taking parts in both with CND. There would be regular rallies and marches. And then I would have my young children with me, my little girl in the buggy, and I'll prepare a little picnic and so on. And my boy, who was about 5-6-year-old, he'd be walking for miles and miles. And it would very often end up in Hyde Park, where sometimes we had, little stage, and there would be speakers, etc., and all the mothers with young children and other people settle down to eat something and so on. There's a picnic going on, and there are speeches going on, and so on. So, it was very, very strong. I mean, I remember one of the most impressive thing I saw was 24 hours vigil outside the South African embassy. Totally selfless group of young people. I don't know where they came from and where they disappeared after the democratization of South Africa. But 24 hours, they 4 or 5 people standing and leafleting and so on. I find respect that a lot of people come together and rally around only for the sake of having justice in the world, like out of conscience, their own conscience, that this is unjust, this is wrong, we are not going to stand for it, and so and so needs help, or we need to basically support this cause and so on. And these are kind of, you go on these marches, and at the moment that's going on because of Gaza and Palestine, people from all walks of life, every color, every age, you will see the punks, with lots of colorful hair and so on, and bring down their body, and a lot of body piercing and tattoos and so on. And then you will see country gentlemen in sweet jackets and so on, and country ladies, coming out, and in between all these groups. So I don't know if that happens in the other countries, but I find UK especially really remarkable that people stand up for the sake of principle and human rights. And in the 80s, the biggest causes were CND, NA, and anti-apartheid. And I became more and more aware of it and became more and more active in it until I remember, I think the last big rally we did was Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday, I think.
Yes.
Because we had a big rally. It was a birthday rally. And we had lots of speeches and songs and musicians. And it wasn't must be late 80s. And it wasn't, much later that I can't remember that, but it probably was 70th birthday and late 80s and so on. And soon after that, we started to hear about the change in South Africa.
Arju, you talk about joining the picket lines. You talked about these mass rallies where lots of people like yourself took your little kids along with you and then possibly had a picnic thereafter. I'm wondering what was the events that made you so conscious about South African politics and joining the anti-apartheid movements?
I was probably one of the tens of thousands of people who, learning through media, through these marches, became aware of the injustice, and we became aware of Nelson Mandela being incarcerated for such a long time, Robben Island. It became a big cause. And I wasn't unique in that respect, but I suppose I was by nature probably one of those people who could not take injustice and who was bothered. And when you felt that something was not right, you need to speak out and you need to stand up. There are hundreds and thousands who are not very political minded. They are not politicized. We don't need to blame them for anything. That's, if they're not, they're not. But I probably was one of those people who became politicized. And I was among tens of thousands. So I think by nature, if I look back, maybe I learned that from my father. He was wrong, and at times he having arguments with him. For God's sake, who gave you the given right to just start creating trouble for yourself? Because these things very often end up in conflict and losing your own on your interests, etc. So that coupled with the fact that London, as I said, is a hub of these kind of activities. And I got more and more into it. And then as I went into the media, then that became part of your working life as well. And that has continued to this day.
I think media does have a huge influence on your thinking and the different causes that one does follow, because you're faced with all of these realities on a daily basis through your work, and that does shape your outlook and shape your future going forward. But let's talk about the rise of Islamophobia the world over. We also know that there are those protests happening in the UK, horrific protests against migrant communities. How are you viewing that? You are currently visiting South Africa, but how do you believe all of that is impacting on the migrant communities? And this isn't an overnight phenomena, is it? These are issues that has been simmering in the background for years and years and years on end. And you just need, I guess, that straw on the camel's back, the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back.
You're quite right. I mean, I have watched these news with alarm, but not surprised and not shocked. Islamophobia in particular is a phenomenon that has risen, I think, much more in the last few decades, and that I personally feel the source of that is Palestine. The more people are reacting to it, and not just the Muslims, people are standing up for Palestinian rights and so on. But let's go back to the fact that it's not so not new and not so unfamiliar for me. When I arrived there, in early days of my arrival, was in the 70s. Racism was really rife, and there were no laws to protect you either. Now, at least we have some laws that insulting or damaging or attacking people in public as racist attacks is becoming illegal, and there is more protection, and also change of atmosphere, change of environment. More and more migrants have come and have become part of the community, and locals have become aware of it and got used to living with them and realize that they are not as bad as we thought, and they are really quite good human beings. So environment has changed, but at the same time, those elements, extremist elements, are still there. It's not as if they've gone away, but they don't have as much force. In current situation, what happened in the last few
All
weeks,
right,
there were definitely
Arju,
some right-wing political.
can I ask you to hold that thought? Let's continue the discussion right after the ad break. Welcome back. I'm talking to Arjumand Wajid. She is an author. She's also a retired BBC journalist. She lives in Britain. She's visiting South Africa currently because she's here to launch her book, and it is on the life of the late Fatima Meer. Arju, welcome back. And I just want to touch on the problems that was experienced between the Muslim and the Hindu communities in the UK, and this was about a year ago, and I think it was sparked by the BJP government in India. I think that created a lot of tension amongst these two groups in the UK, Muslims and Hindus. Did that kind of die away? Is that something of the past, or is that also simmering behind the scenes, and does that also tie in with this worldwide emergence of something very heinous called Islamophobia?
Did you say between Muslims and Hindus?
Yes.
No, not really.
There were clashes. I covered it. We covered it on our shows here, unless it was very small pockets of these uprisings that probably went unnoticed by the larger British community.
And we had only, as you said, pockets. Actually, I think I can only remember one notable incident, and that happened in a city called Leicester, where for the first time, the minorities became the majority. In other words, the whites were in the minority, and there are a lot of local councils are dominated by the Hindus and Muslims and other minorities. And that was a few years ago, that I think maybe early years of Mr. Modi, that there was a small group of Indian youngsters who started spreading news and started spreading propaganda, which was downright Muslim, anti-Muslim. But then very quickly, even there, Hindus and Muslims who had lived there for a long time together in harmony and with no problem intentions came together and controlled it. So otherwise, there had never really been any frictions or particular animosities between Hindu and Muslim communities. It has been always a problem with the racist groups who have no religion or who have all religions. I mean, they are local youngsters and they are local white supremacist and racist groups. And they are, most of them became illegal. There is one which is still active and under British democratic system, they have not been labeled as terrorists, and they haven't been banned. And so they're still active, but they really are a very small group. I mean, for instance, the last few weeks, the people who are creating problems and who went mad almost and, caused a lot of destruction and this and that, they were no more than 200 or 250. And yet, as opposed to that, then the anti-racist groups, which again included all communities, whites, blacks, Christian, Muslims, Hindus, they came out in their thousands to protest and to make sure that these people are not welcomed in our communities. And I must say the government also took a very swift action, and they rounded up a lot of them. And I think there have been more than 1,700 arrests so far. I mean, initially they were, like under 1,000 arrests, but within days. And not only that, the justice system also took a very serious notice of it, and the sentences were handed down very swiftly, and they were quite severe, like imprisonments. And so that's still continuing, and that was the most heartening thing I thought, that there's a small number of racist groups definitely uh, instigated and definitely encouraged by certain political elements. And one party, I won't perhaps mention it here, which is a small, fairly racist party. Uh, they probably were behind it as well, because that's people are protesting outside their office. So small number of these racist groups created havoc, did a lot of damage. On the other hand, thousands of anti-racist people came out peacefully, great dignified demos in most big cities, and it has been appreciated. So I would say that that's a very encouraging sign that the majority are fair-minded people. And although we'll never have a time when these racists or these antisocial groups are inactive or go away, they're always going to be there. But at least that's not going to have a major impact on communities' lives.
You visited South Africa on very many occasions. As a journalist, you came to cover the release of Nelson Mandela, and you've been here several times since. What was the attraction for you to South Africa? And when you came to cover the release and the inauguration as well of Nelson Mandela, how did that shape your worldview on apartheid and just in general South Africa moving forward?
As I said, I think I became very aware of about what apartheid system is and how awful and how cruel and oppressive it is. So that awareness was there. And then when Nelson Mandela was released, that was one of the biggest news probably of the century. And I think that was exciting. And that immediately, I don't know how many other journalists or people wanted to, but I wanted to come to South Africa to see Nelson Mandela's South Africa and to see how the society was. And just then an opportunity presented itself. In the BBC those days, we used to have this incredible bursary where you got 4 months full paid leave and expenses, etc., to go and do anything in the world that you wanted to do, and you wanted to, it was important for you. And I put in an application for a trip to South Africa to see how the apartheid laws were being dismantled and how life was changing, and in specific to study the Indian community's role in the liberation movement, because during these years we also became aware of personalities like Ahmed Kathrada and others, and I kind of became aware of the fact that the Indian community had played a very important, if not disproportionately high role, and paid for it as well in the liberation movement, considering their percentage in the population. But that I slowly learned after coming here, especially that was no coincidence, because apartheid system had divided the communities in such a way that Black communities really had far less means and opportunities and were able to organize themselves much later, whereas Indian community organized itself, but also because of the apartheid system, they still had slightly better environmental circumstances and they organized themselves much earlier. And so their struggle against apartheid and racism started early. And so that's how their role became quite important and quite pivotal in achieving the eventual freedom. So my project, my proposal was for these two particular subjects, and I was exceptionally lucky. I mean, that was such a highly competitive bursary application that I got that, and then I came here, and I was just like so excited. It was really the best opportunity of my life, I think, And then it was like magic coming to South Africa. And I was especially going to Mandela's more than anything else. Mandela, South Africa. And I was lucky during that time that I actually did manage to meet President Mandela or Madiba. We got to know him later on. And I have a picture with him that I obviously display in my sitting room very proudly. I was able to meet many heads of state during my work, and I have photographs with all kind of leaders. But the only one that I'm proud of, and I'm not embarrassed to show off, is Nelson Mandela. And of course, another one was Yasser Arafat, whom I met also in South Africa at Nelson Mandela's inauguration.
Let's talk about when did your paths cross with Ismail and Fatima Meer and the extended Meer family. You are a retired journalist, and most journalists do go on to write books. So when did your paths cross, and why, and how did you decide that you need and must write a book on the activist, the late Fatima Meer? And she was a phenomenal woman in her own right as well.
Absolutely. That came much later in the 20,000 something. But Fatima Meer was the first person I met in South Africa when I arrived here. I didn't even know anybody's name. I think I just knew two names that we were familiar with, was Fatima Meer's and Professor Salman Nadvi. I knew because of his background and his father being such a famous scholar. So Fatima Meer we knew because we used to interview her from the BBC. Anytime there was, South Africa was in news, we would be looking for people to interview. And I worked for Urdu service of the BBC World Service, and we also covered for Hindi service as well. And Fatima Meer could speak kind of broken Urdu Hindi because her father was such a literary man. He was very keen to teach his children Urdu as well as English literature. And he had made a point of teaching his children, particularly Fatima being the eldest. So she could speak a little bit of Urdu. And I had interviewed her a few times, but I did not know much more than that. So when I was coming over, I phoned her and I said, I'm coming to South Africa.
Can I interrupt you there, please? Let's just go for our final ad break and come back and continue our story on the amazing late Fatima Meer, who is an absolute icon in South Africa. She was a fierce apartheid activist, and Arjumand Wajid has written a book on Fatima Meer. We will continue right after the break. Welcome back to the final segment of the show this morning on Perspective. My guest is retired BBC journalist Arjumand Wajid. She's currently visiting South Africa to launch her book on the late Fatima Meer, and is here also to talk about her connections with the South African people, the highlights of her work as a BBC journalist. Arju, welcome back, and I do apologize for interrupting mid-sentence, but that's the name of the game. Do you want to pick up from where we left off?
Right. So I was talking about how I met Fatima. So that's how I knew Fatima, through broadcasting and through interviewing her for the BBC before my arrival. When I came, I phoned her and said, Professor Meer, I'm coming over for this, the 4 months, like a study trip. And she said, okay, let us know when you come here. And the day I arrived, like, sort of midday-ish, I phoned her in the evening and I said, I'm here. And so she said, okay. She asked me where I was staying, and she said, okay, I'll come down in a minute. And she turned up at the door of this place where I was staying, in a kaftan, looking like this, had just walked out of, her study or whatever. And that was our first meeting, and that just started the most wonderful experience of my life in this country. That she, and then the same evening I met her husband, Ismail Meer. They were the people who basically introduced me to anybody and everybody in South Africa. Through them, I met most important leaders of ANC and Natal Indian Congress in Durban, people like Ahmed Kathrada, people like Ibrahim Ismail Ibrahim, and most of the, like Praveen Gordon. So I was going around interviewing these people, meeting them, and really getting to know the history and the people, etc. So I must say, I mean, although the biography suggestion came much, much later, by this time, we had become very close friends. And I adored, especially Ismail Meer. He was like a big brother that I never had. He guided me about the politics, who I should meet, and etc., etc. And not only that, most of the time he also introduced me to them. So it was like, like doors opening for me through them. And I got to know South Africa. I got to love them, and I became a very close family friend with Ismail and Fatima until the last days of their lives. When Ismail passed away a few years before Fatima, no, many years before Fatima, I was really devastated. I thought that I'd lost a very close friend, but also a big brother. And then Fatima had also suffered stroke. And by then, we really were very, very close friends. Every time I came here, I phoned her. And I didn't stay with them all these years, but after, after Ismail Bhai passed away, she insisted that I must stay with her, because I remember she saying, "No, you're staying with me now because I need the company more."
Oh, wow.
So that's how I started staying with her and became much, much closer to Fatima. I hadn't been that close to her while Ismail Bhai was there. I was much closer to him. And also, to be honest, she could be quite intimidating at times. I was in awe of her. And you had to be careful when you spoke in front of her. And I got put down in no uncertain terms a few times, and she thought I had not done something that did not please her. But after Ismail Bhai passed away, then we became much closer, and I really got to know her woman to woman in a way. And I saw how devastated she was. First, a few years earlier by her son's death, that devastated her. But now after Ismail Bhai, her life totally changed. And then she had stroke. And so we developed such an understanding of each other. And during one of those early trips, I saw that she was trying to write her own autobiography. But because of the stroke and because of the macular degeneration, because she was also diabetic, she was really struggling. And one trip when I was really that day, I was leaving and I went to say goodbye to her bedroom. I saw her really feeling very down and quite feeling sort of hopeless. And it's because I turned out that the autobiography was not progressing. She couldn't find the right typist, all sorts of problems. So just on the spur of the moment, I said to her, "Babe, would you like me to write your biography?" And she really perked up and she said, "Arjumand, I would like that very much." And that's how it came about. But the enormity of the commitment and what challenge I was accepting, I had no idea at the time. I'll tell you the difficulties of writing about a person living thousands of miles away and you not having grown up in that country. It really was far too difficult a challenge, but I had made a commitment and I wanted to do it as well, because the more I studied about her, the more I researched about her, I felt this was a really, really a great project for me to continue. I had lots and lots of difficulties after that. I was still working for the BBC. I'd also embarked upon another career as a freelance international trainer. I was traveling all over the world. And in between, I was finding time to write a little bit or do the research for this book. I should have earned at least 2 PhDs on the amount of work I did on this.
I'm sure you have. Arju, we've come to the end of the show very quickly. How has her family, friends, and comrades responded to the fact that you're now here in South Africa to launch the book. It's finally completed. Undoubtedly, you spoke about the challenges in completing the book. How long did it take you, and how is it being received now?
It's embarrassing to tell you how long it took me. I think the first time I came back, after having this conversation, the following year I came back to start my work, and I stayed with her and I interviewed her over a period of a month. Because, and I was recording her, because she was not a well person. You had to see, when she had the energy. And also she was still very busy, lots of visitors coming and going and all that. So it took a month, and I think I just interviewed her that trip. And then I made many following trips to interview other people about her. And there's a whole list in the book of the people that I did interview. Sorry, I've lost the strain. What was I saying?
How has family and friends, you are now in South Africa to launch the book. How are family and friends responding to the book?
Yes.
I know the launch is only in a few days' time, but have you had a very positive response?
I'd had tremendous response because she was such an iconic and popular personality, such a great leader. And I realized how much people loved her. Absolutely everyone that has heard about this, or everyone from the media that I have approached, or the organizers have approached, nobody has so far said, "Oh no, we can't do it." And I've got plenty of sort of chances and being offered opportunities to talk about the book. Tremendous, much more than I had actually expected, because after all these years, it had taken so long, and I've been quite ill, developed some progressive condition, and so my travel had been very difficult and so on, and I'd lost contact with a lot of people. But I was so pleasantly surprised and delighted that there is such a warm, wonderful feeling about Fatima that everybody wants to talk about her and want to know about it.
And that's where we leave it. Arjumand Wajid, thank you indeed for being with us on the show today. Much luck and success with the launch of the book. Undoubtedly, it's going to be embraced with open arms. I wish you lots and lots of good health going forward. Thank you indeed for your time on the show today. I'm honored that you are a guest of Hilaal TV on Perspective right here in Women's Month. So you, an amazing, powerful woman yourself, and you're accolading another icon, and that, of course, is Fatima Meer. Thank you, and go well. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Thank you, and it has been a great honor to do this book, and thank you for welcoming it and for letting me speak about it.
And there you have it, the amazing Arjumand Wajid, a retired journalist of the BBC. She's here to launch her book on Fatima Meer, and that brings us to the end of the show for today. Thank you for watching. Till next week at the same time as always, Khuda Hafiz. From me, Julie Ali.